Welcome back to part 3 on how to mic a drum kit. In this part, we're going to be talking about how to mic a drum kit using 4 microphones. 2 mics are great, but what if you have more? What if you have a condenser microphone? Condenser microphones are awesome for all kinds of reasons, and they're good on all kinds of instruments. They reproduce a very true sound. They're very transparent. They do require phantom power, and they are quite a bit more expensive than dynamics, but they are not rare, and there are tons of budget condenser mics. This is a Warm Audio 14. They call it the WA14. This is basically a copy of the AKG 414. The AKG 414 is an incredibly famous microphone. It uses a special capsule that's different from the others. They developed a capsule called a C12. I'll get into a whole tangent. The AKGs can get very expensive, especially the vintage ones, but the Warm Audio WA14 is a faithful reproduction of the original 414, and it's quite a bit cheaper than if you were to go and try to buy a vintage AKG 414. We're going to use a stereo pair for overheads. We're going to take this previous single overhead, we're going to use that to mic the snare. The D112 is still in front of the kick drum, so we're going to have 4 microphones, and we'll get a full stereo picture of the drums with kick and snare having their own dedicated microphones. This will now become our snare mic. Now, there are lots of ways to mic a snare drum. Typically in the studio, we will do 2 microphones, a snare top microphone and a bottom microphone. The top is going to get a lot more attack. It's going to get the stick hitting the snare. The bottom is going to get more of the rattle of the snares themselves. It's going to get more resonance, have a little more bottom. So we're going to move this cymbal and tom out of our way for 1 second. Now, it can be tricky to sneak a microphone down into this snare. And another thing you have to keep in mind when you're miking a drum kit is there's going to be a human behind it playing the drum. You got to watch your overheads, make sure that they're out of their way. Any drum you're miking, you don't want them to hit it with their stick. And trust me, it happens, and it happens fairly often. So it's always trying to get a compromise between getting a good mic position on the drum and being out of the way of the drummer, because the drummer can't drum if there's microphones in his way. So what we're going to do is sneak this microphone in here. What we're aiming for is the center of the drum itself. I'm going to say maybe 2.5 inches from the side of the grill to the rim of the snare. Where this microphone is pointing is going to pick up everything that's in front of it. If I were to, say, take the easy route of getting in, why can't I just mic it from over here? Well, that's great. You did mic the snare, but you also mic'd the kick drum, this tom, and some of the floor tom. You're going to get as much kick as you are snare in that track. So you want to be aware of what's in front of your microphone. A better choice than this, if I only had 1 microphone, would probably be a Shure SM57. I think we have one of those lying around here. These are a bit more directional than a 58. A little tip for you guys out there, if you want to know a secret, the SM58 and the 57 are virtually the same exact microphone. The only difference is this grill. And believe it or not, the grill does change the frequency response and the polar pattern a tiny bit. These are both cardioid mics. They both pick up what's in front of them. 57, I feel personally, is a little more directional, has a little more top end in it. It's a perfect microphone for miking snares. But we are going with our original 58. Again, we're going to point it at the center of the snare, a few inches above the rim of the snare, and most importantly, out of the way of the drummer. So when Duder comes in, I'll ask him, is anything in your way? And we will work together to get a balance between the best position for the microphones and making sure that it's not in his way. We'll put this tom back in. Watch the legs of the stand, and it can be tricky sometimes. You want to make sure that your stand, your microphone stand, cannot possibly be hit by this cymbal. So you want to move it around and make sure that no matter how he hits this cymbal, it is not going to hit your microphone. This is pretty close. If he does have an issue, we will find a different stand and we will use a different stand, because the last thing you want in your recording is the sound of a stick hitting a microphone or hitting a microphone stand. So now that that's set up, we're going to bring in our two overheads. Like I said before, these are two condenser microphones. The Warm Audio copy of the AKG 414s. We want to get a stereo picture of this drum kit. It's really important if you're using two microphones as an overhead, and you want to make sure to use either a stereo pair, which means that they were paired in the factory to be identical microphones, or at the very least the same make and model of microphone. If they're two different microphones, the microphones are going to sound too different. You're not going to get an accurate stereo picture, and there can be all kinds of other issues. So you want to use two of the same microphones. In this case, these are large diaphragm condensers. You can also use, and I do often use, depending on the sound, small diaphragm condensers. These are Rode NT5s. They're, a budget pair of small diaphragm condensers. These are a stereo pair, so they were matched in the factory. These are small, but they're incredibly powerful. They actually produce a flatter frequency response than the large diaphragm condensers, believe it or not. So these are fantastic for overhead mics. They're great for all kinds of other things. Really, any stereo miking situation, if you're doing XY or a space pair, small diaphragm condensers are fantastic. But in this case, we're going to use large diaphragms with the AKG 414s. Luckily, we have these giant boom stands, but it can be tricky to get stands that are either big enough or sturdy enough to hang two microphones high above a drum kit. You can use, the standard boom stands like the one that we have on this guy, but they do get a bit wobbly, especially if you're using a heavier mic. You want to start off low, and like I was talking about before, the center of the drum kit is not the center of this kick drum. The center of this drum kit is probably around here on this axis. So with that in mind, we're going to move our second microphone into place. We want to make sure that they're level with the ground, pointing straight down. And the reason we're starting low is because I'm not worried about the relation of the two microphones to the drums right now. I'm worried about where they are if I were looking down at the drum kit in a 2D fashion. So I want this microphone somewhere around here. So I'm going to move this back. And then the second microphone, our sweet spot is going to be, if you were looking from above, where this snare and where this kick drum, where those lines would intersect right here, we're going to go straight up above that. So we might have to bring this arm out a little bit. In a professional studio environment, it's rare for somebody to set up a kit, mic it, record it, and then be like, oh, that's perfect, that's it. There's always some trial and error listening to the microphones and figuring out if you can place them differently. I'm gonna widen this out a little bit. And you can see, as I'm placing these microphones, I'm moving them, I'm looking down at the kit, trying to see exactly where these microphones are going to end up. So, I'm gonna come around to the front of the kit. I'm gonna sit down where the drummer sits. And this point that I was talking about, right about here, I'm gonna put my head down there and look up, and you can see, is that capsule pointing at you? It should be. I'm gonna back this up a tiny bit. I am gonna let you in on a fantastic little secret. So, the issue you can have when you have two microphones in a stereo setup is phase. And phase happens when, let's say I hit this snare. If this microphone is here. Let's say this one is 6 feet away. The sound from this snare is going to take longer to hit the one that's far away than the one overhead. They can line up in a way that when the sound from the snare hits the second microphone, it inverts that first waveform and cancels it out. That's called phase cancellation. The two microphones are out of phase. An easy way to kind of get a rough idea of if your microphones will be in phase is they need to be the same distance from the sound source. So what we're going to do, grab a cable, any cable. Like I said before, the sound source for this microphone is going to be this area in between the kick drum and the snare drum. So I'm going to measure the distance from here to the top of this microphone. Right? So from here to the top of the microphone. Now this distance right here, this second microphone can exist anywhere that the tip of this wire is pointing, anywhere in this little dome that I'm making. So you can see this is way too close, and we would be getting a little bit of phase issues. It's not the end of the world. You can always fix it in the edit, in post. I really hate telling people to fix it in the edit. You shouldn't fix it in the edit, but it is fairly straightforward to fix phase issues on a drum kit in the edit. You can zoom very far into the waveform. You can pick one snare hit. You can see the waveform on each overhead, and you just want to make sure that they are lined up and that when one is peaking, the other isn't in a valley because they'll cancel each other out. So let me show you the measurement again. We're going from the space in between the kick and the snare to this microphone. That same distance, this second microphone can be anywhere on that axis. Move it in a tiny bit. So right about there, I think would be all right. So we're going to get Duder back in here, have him drum a couple bars, see what it sounds like, and go from there. Duder's going to give us a couple bars, and we'll see what it sounds like. You can see, especially if you're wearing headphones, with a stereo overhead setup, you get a much more accurate picture of what the drum kit actually sounds like. When Duder rolls around the drums, you can hear it roll around the drums, just like if you were sitting in the drummer's stool or out in the audience. The two dynamics are fairly cheap. You can get away with two SM58s that can also be used for vocals, guitars, pretty much any instrument you want. And these two condensers are a good way to start stereo miking, not just drums, but pianos, groups of vocals, really anything that requires a stereo picture. Remember, this is just getting started. This is a somewhat basic idea of how to mic a drum kit. There are way more ways to mic a drum kit, even with just 4 microphones. There's an infinite number of possibilities. You can get into miking every tom, top and bottom snare, front and back kick, stereo overheads, and then a room mic. So we'll be releasing future videos on more advanced methods on how to mic the drums. I'm Dan from MNYK Studios. A big thank you to Duder. Again, appreciate it, man, for drumming for us. Make sure to like, share it, subscribe if you want to see more. We're going to have a bunch of videos coming out on a whole bunch of topics.